I don't think I've ever heard anyone like have such a laugh, you know? Like he really does get hysterical. That's why he told me he was after you.
Doink.
Just laugh to do like Maddie, yeah. They don't do anything. Standing there. No, it's hard. It's sad. I know it's true.
Toot 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 toot. Boing. Toot 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 toot. Boink. Toot 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 toot. Boink. You want to go outside?
Maddie's bobbling her little heart out there. Where? Where's the hill, Maddie?
Outside.
Dougie. I'll just do it standing up.
Happy birthday to you. Oh yeah.
Do the kettle hubba. Like we do in the Pokemon.
Yeah.
Go. No, Nikki, like in the book.
Oh, boom.
Do Nikki, you didn't know the book. Turn around and see.
You gotta go for it, man.
He knows how to do it. Okay. Yay!
Oh.
We can light it again. Should we light it again?
That was nice, huh, Puto?
Make me hold it.
Why not?
Yeah.
Because it made my hands hurt.
Okay.
Yeah, it makes our hands
Sing
hurt.
again.
I'll blow it.
Happy birthday.
Birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Maria. Happy birthday to you.
Okay, Maria.
The only candle we have in the house and it ain't lighting.
I will just do it from the little thingy.
Okay. Yay! I know we have some somewhere.
That's what we're going to do on Marty's birthday.
When's Marty's birthday? When's your birthday?
November 21st.
Oh, when's Marty's birthday?
Maddie. 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 Madison.
Number one, your food, everybody. That's number one.
Look, I'm on a pony ride. I'm on a bubble ride of I think they said my name.
Molly.
I think they said my name on the speaker.
No. Not yet.
I'm being hungry.
Soon. In about an hour.
Can we go to the arcade?
Yeah, we're gonna go there in about an hour. Not even an hour. We're gonna go and eat, and then we're gonna go to the arcade.
There's computers. We lost theirs.
No, I don't think
We
so.
lost Kayla.
Oh, okay. Well, there's Kayla right there.
Maddie?
What's her?
Hey, that's Sammy.
No, last
Which room is it? Oh, it's mine.
Annie, what's your last name?
Matt.
My dad is videotaping us. Stop videotaping us! Don't make me punch that camera.
No, just stand. I'll get a picture of you guys.
And no one else? No one needs me too.
That's very nice, Christine.
Me too. You guys.
Hi, guys.
Behave yourself.
You guys hurt?
The bag sleeping. Everybody excited? No? Everybody have a good time?
You guys want drinks?
You have a question? What is it? Whose armpits smell?
Presents. Great. You're like playing in the balls and slides.
Does everybody know where the bathroom is? Okay.
Are you videotaping me?
Yes, I am. You want to say hello to Madison?
Can I videotape you?
Okay. Oh. Hi, guys.
Let me try now.
Just 1 second.
Can I try? Let me.
Oh, slow down, Maya. Slow down. Just look in there.
I can see you.
Hi. Okay. No, that's it. Don't let Amy. All right.
Can I try? I want to see you. I can't see Maddie. Can I try?
Just a
I
sec.
can see Maddie. Hello. I can see your big nose.
All right.
Okay, it's my turn.
Okay. Okay. Next.
But I want to take Kelly. Then my turn and then Kelly, where are you? No.
Okay, guys.
My turn, my turn.
All right. Yep. Get ready, get ready.
Today's Madison's birthday and she's 7 years old. 1, 2, 3. Birthday, Madison's birthday. Happy birthday. Happy birthday. And happy 6, 6, 5, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
You can just rip it, buddy. You don't have to save it. Hey, you read the cards first. Maddie, the cards first, that's it. You think they were street rats in Paris?
Yeah.
the old one too.
Bonjour tout le monde, bienvenue à notre assemblée d'hiver. La classe de Madame Barbeau et la classe de Madame Doucet vous présentent une chanson, un rap et deux danses. Merci.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our winter assembly. Madame Barbeau's class and Madame Doucet's class will sing and dance for your enjoyment.
Chapeau,
you're sitting down, call.
Voici une danse fort funky qui s'appelle danse de salutation. Please enjoy this folk dance from Denmark. It's called Dance of Greeting.
common problems when you set up IP addresses. Here's some guidelines to follow as we assign host ID addresses. Remember that each host ID must be unique to the network on which it's located. So I could not have a host ID of 1 and another host ID of 1. And remember, we can assign ID numbers to routers, to clients, to servers. So we need to make sure that those ID numbers are unique throughout the entire network. Also, we don't use a host ID of 255. And remember that 255 in binary is an octet of all ones, of 8 ones. Because 255 is a broadcast address. So if we send something to 255, it's actually sent to every TCP/IP host instead of the particular client we're trying to communicate with. So don't use that as a host ID. Finally, we don't typically use 0 as a host ID either, because 0 typically refers to this network, and it doesn't allow any communication to that client to be routed off to other networks. In other words, someone from another network could not communicate with your client. So we only use the numbers 1 through 254 when we refer to our different clients. Well, what happens if we set our IP addresses incorrectly? What kind of problems are we going to encounter out on the network? One problem in TCP/IP communications is when different hosts on the same network are given different network IDs. In that case, when the TCP/IP packet is sent out on the network, it will go to the router because the router sees the packet is addressed to a client that is not on that local network. However, of course, the client really is on that local network. You've just addressed the client incorrectly, and that packet will never find its way to the client. You just won't be able to communicate. In fact, let's back up for a moment and see how that could evolve. Here we have our host IDs on network A, 124.00.27. Let's assume for a moment that we set the wrong network ID for network A. Let's say the server, for example, had the network ID of not 124, but 123.0.0.29. Now, when this client tries to communicate with this server, it packages the IP address going to 123.0.0.29. IP notices that this address is not the same as the local network. The local network would be indicated by 124. So it routes the packet, sends it off to the router. The router looks around both directions and over here for a network 123.0.0. Can't find it. The packet is never delivered. So there's no way we can communicate with that server unless its address is corrected. Another common problem is when we assign duplicate IP addresses. Now when we assign a duplicate address, let's look at network B here. Let's say that this first computer was assigned the address of 28, just like the second computer. When the first computer comes up, when it boots, it tries to use its IP address. It sends a packet out on the network and says, hey, I'm up, I'm running, this is my IP address. Let me come on into the IP world. However, when it does this, it notices there's a duplicate IP address. The computer below also has the host ID of 28. When it detects this duplicate address, it will shut down the IP services on the first machine. So IP will never load, it'll never bind to the network card. You will be unable to communicate with any other machine via TCP/IP. Now, if you had NetBEUI or NWLink installed, you could communicate with those protocols, but you've certainly cut off your ability to use TCP/IP once you've entered a duplicate address. You'll get a notice, a pop-up message on that client indicating the duplicate message. Also on the other machine, the second machine here that has the duplicate, it will also receive a message saying that it has a duplicate IP address. Now oftentimes it's very difficult to track down which machines have those duplicates, but that can help you a little bit, that the message will show up on both machines. But those are very common problems, either having the same IP address or having different network IDs on the same network. Very important things to watch out for. So you want to be very careful as to how you enter those IP numbers. Typos are not allowed in the IP world. In this section, we learned how the 4 octets of an IP address are used to route an IP packet to the appropriate machine. The first part of the IP address specifies the network that the client is located on. That could be using 1 octet, 2 octets, or 3 octets. If it's a Class A address, it uses the first, ranges from 1 to 126. If it's a Class B address, uses the first 2 octets for the network ID, ranges from 128 to 191. And if it's a Class C address, it uses 3 octets for the network ID, and that ranges from 192 to 223. The remaining octets are used to designate the host ID, or the ID number for each client on that particular network. We also talked about the problems if you don't configure the network IDs correctly, or if you have host IDs that are duplicate to other hosts on the same network. In this section, we'll talk about using subnet masking to divide your network into several segments, which can help you reduce network traffic and also let you use some more complicated schemes in your network architecture. First of all, what is a subnet? In this example, we show a network that's a Class B network. It uses the network ID of 131.107. And as you may recall, we have about 65,000 host IDs that can be assigned to this one network. However, we may be geographically diverse. We may have other considerations in our network that would dictate that we don't want to have all of the hosts on the same network. But yet we only have one network ID available to us. Well, there is a way that we can actually break this one network up into several subnetworks or subnets and have different hosts on each of those subnets. In effect, we've created more than one network by using the same network ID. Now in the example here, we actually have 3 networks. The main network here has the network ID of 131.107, and then the number 12, which is typically used for a host ID, is actually designating a separate network. Then we have another subnet, subnet 1 here. It's using the number 10, where we typically have a host ID, to specify another subnet. And then the third subnet, subnet 2, is using the number 3, where we typically have a host ID to designate a third network. So we've used now one Class B network, and yet we've split it into 3 different networks by using subnets. If we're going to break up our network ID into several subnets, we need to do some calculations to see if we have, first of all, enough subnets to meet our needs, and then once we've broken our network into various subnets, do we have enough host IDs remaining on that subnet to handle all the hosts on each network? When we're breaking our network into subnets, there are several things we need to decide. One is, how many subnets do we need? Do I have 4 or 5 different geographical locations? Do I have different departments in my company that I'd like to be segmented so they don't have traffic crossing over all the time, dragging down my network performance? All of those things can enter in how many subnets we decide to have on our network. Once we've decided how many subnets we want to have, we also need to look at how many host IDs are going to be on each subnet. Now, if we come up with a subnet that's going to use the first 3 octets for our network ID, that only leaves us 254 host IDs on each subnet. If I had a subnet with 500 hosts, that scheme would not work. I'd have to come up with some other method to get enough subnets without reducing my host IDs. And we'll see how to do that in a moment through the subnet mask that we use. Once we've decided on the appropriate number of subnets, the appropriate number of hosts, if that will be met by the subnet scheme we're coming up with, then we define a subnet mask that will meet these needs. And notice we're using just one subnet mask for our entire network. That subnet mask must be used universally across our entire TCP/IP installation. Once we've designed the mask, then we go ahead and create the subnet IDs for each subnet, and then we assign the host IDs for each computer on those subnets. Now let's talk about what a subnet mask is and how it's used to separate your network ID into several subnets. A subnet mask is a mask or a filter that hides part of your TCP/IP address from the network ID scheme. So you can use additional binary numbers that were designated by your network ID to specify additional network IDs. The binary digits that are not hidden by the subnet mask would indicate the host ID. So by defining a subnet mask that uses more digits than your host ID, you can break your network into subnets. And then, once you have subnets, the subnet mask can help determine whether that IP address is local to your own subnet or whether it's out there on the large network. In other words, another subnet, another network that needs to be routed for that communication to be completed. Let's look at how a subnet mask actually breaks down your network ID into several subnets by using the binary digits that make up an IP address. Now remember that an IP address is actually 4 octets, or 4 sets of binary values. Each binary value has 8 binary digits. A typical subnet mask, as specified in decimal notation, is 255.255.255, getting a little redundant here, aren't we, .0. How does this translate into binary? Well, as you may recall, the largest binary number we can represent with our 8 digits is 255, so that's all ones. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There we go. Okay. And I'll just put a 0 for the last value. Now these ones that we see here are actually what we will filter out or what we will let flow through. The process that's used for a subnet mask is a binary OR process, an AND/OR process actually. We can think of these digits as either a pipe, if we have a 1, or a sponge, if we have a 0. So what does a pipe do to water? Well, it lets it flow through. So it's carried right on through. What does a sponge do to water? It absorbs it. Nothing flows through, so it just stops it, doesn't flow through anymore. So as we look at our subnet mask of all ones, 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 and then a 0, our ones are the pipes. They're going to let that address flow through. The zeros are like our sponge. They're going to stop the address from flowing through. So let's look at an example of the IP address we assigned to our NT server. 137.107.4.10. In this case, 137 will flow through because the ones will carry that entire IP address over. The 107 will flow through because all of those ones will let it carry over. The 4 will flow through because our ones are acting as pipes again, but our 10 is absorbed by all these zeros, by our little sponges. So the network address that's going to be represented using this subnet mask is 137.107.4, and then the last octet is used for our host ID. Now this was a really simple example where we used the entire octet as part of the subnet mask. We're letting all the number either flow through or not flow through. We'll get into some more complicated examples in a minute where we can have numbers where not all of the digits in one octet are a 1, and then we can get even more complex subnetting schemes, have a greater number of hosts if we need that, or a greater number of subnets. We'll vary those filters to meet our needs. Let's look at some common subnet masks that are used to divide your network into subnets. We always use a subnet mask, even if we're not dividing our network into subnets. If you're not doing that, let's look at the subnets that are used for each of the three classes of networks. First of all, for a Class A, remember that a Class A network uses the first octet, the first set of numbers, to designate the network, and the remaining 3 octets are used to designate the host ID. In that case, we would use a subnet mask of 255.0.0.0. The 255 translates to all ones, and that lets the network ID flow through, while the zeros in the remaining 3 octets stop that number from being interpreted as a network ID. Subsequently, it's interpreted as a host ID, and that's exactly how Class A addresses should work. So that's just the default subnet mask for Class A networks. For Class B networks, remember that the first 2 octets are used to represent the network ID. So in this case, we use a subnet mask of 255.255.0.0. This way, the first 2 octets are going to be passed through. That's the standard network ID for a Class B address. And the remaining 2 octets are going to be absorbed or stopped by these zeros so they don't flow through as a network ID, and so those numbers can be interpreted as a host ID. Finally, a Class C address, as you may recall, uses the first 3 octets to designate the network ID. And so if we use a subnet mask of 255.255.255.0, that would be all ones for the first 3 octets. That would allow the network ID to flow through, and the remaining octet with all zeros would stop the passage of that number, and so that number would then be interpreted as the host ID instead of the network ID. And we have an example below on this slide. We have an IP address of 131.107.16.200, and we have a subnet mask of 255.255.0.0. The 255s are going to allow that network address to flow through. So we see the resulting network ID after the subnet mask has let it flow through of 131.107. The host address, 16.200, has been stopped by the subnet mask. Remember, the subnet mask is only used to determine what the network ID is. So now TCP/IP knows that 16.200 is used for the host ID rather than the network ID. Now let's look at a subnet mask that can be used to actually break down a network ID into several subnets. This would be different than the default subnet mask we just saw. In this example, we have 2 network classes we're looking at, and we're using a subnet mask that's different from the default. This subnet mask will allow us to break down this network ID into several subnets. In the Class A network here, we're using a subnet mask of 255.240.0.0. Let's look at how that is represented in binary digits. The first octet, 255, is all ones. The second octet, 240, is represented by 4 ones and then zeros. And this is typically how we want to construct our subnet masks. The higher order digit should always be 1, and any remaining digits we don't want to use for subnetting should always be 0. Where does the number 240 come from? Well, if we interpret the binary values here, remember the highest value is 128, and then the next one is 64, 32, and 16. We do some quick math in our heads and add those 4 numbers, 128, 64, 32, and 16. That's the decimal sum of 240. So the subnet mask of 255.240 uses 4 ones in the second octet instead of all ones as in 255 in the example above. Let's look at a Class B example now. Remember that a Class B address uses the first 2 octets typically to designate the host ID. However, in this example, we're going to use the third octet or part of the third octet to designate a subnet. Now the first line, we're using 255.255.255.0 as our subnet mask. This means that the first 3 octets, this one, this one, this one, are used for our network ID, leaving only the last octet for our host IDs. In the second example, we don't have enough host ID numbers if we use 255s all the way across, so we're going to back off on the number of subnets we create. So we're going to use the first 2 as 255s. That's the standard default subnet mask for a Class B network. The third one, we're only going to use 4 ones. And remember, that translates into 240 in decimal. That means the remaining 4 digits, the last zeros there, can be used to designate a host ID in addition to the zeros in the 4th octet. So this gives us a greater number of host IDs for that particular subnet. So in the example below, we have an IP address of 131.107.16.200. We're using a subnet mask of 255.255.240.0. Now let's think for a minute as to what the binary value would be for 16 in decimal. If we look up here, remember the first digit is 1s, the second is 2, then 4, then 8, then 16. So 16 is actually going to be passed through by our subnet mask, because that's the first digit, that 1 there, that's going to let things flow through. So our address of 131.107.16.200 will be passed through with the subnet mask and interpreted as a network ID of 131.107. That's our standard Class B network. And then a subnet of 16. Remember that that 16 is being allowed to pass through, to flow through by this 1 in the subnet mask. The remaining binary digits for the third octet will be 0, because the 16 is 1, 0, 0, 0, 0. Our subnet mask indicated that the last 4 digits are the host ID, so there's no value there for the third octet. The 4th octet has the value of 200. So 200 will be our host ID for this particular client. Let's look at another example to see how a subnet mask is used to determine whether a client's IP address is on the same subnet or on a different subnet. In this example, we see several different IP addresses. Here in example 1, we have 2 addresses, a 153.170.37.16 and a 217.170.172.233. Now it's pretty apparent from example 1 that these IP addresses are on different networks. The first octet is different, and we know that in each class, Class A, Class B, or Class C, the first octet is always used. So those are clearly on different networks. The second example is not so apparent. Here we have 131.107.35.200 and 131.107.61.26. Now this looks like a Class B address. It's in the correct range, and in a Class B address, we use the first 2 octets to specify the network ID. So from outward appearances, example 2 appears as if we're looking at 2 hosts on the same network. They both begin with 131.107. However, we really can't determine which network these hosts are located on until we examine the subnet mask. If we look below, we see a subnet mask, first of all, of 255.255.0.0. That's the default subnet mask for a Class B network. Remember that the 255s are going to let the network ID flow through, so with the first subnet mask, 131.107 will flow through as the network. The remaining 2 octets will be treated as a host ID. So in that case, with that subnet mask, those two addresses would indeed be on the same subnet. However, let's look at the second subnet mask of 255.255.255.0. That's different from the default because we're actually allowing the third octet to be used as part of the network ID. The fourth octet only will be used to specify the host ID. In this case, 131.107, that's fine, but we get to the third octet, 35 is different than 61. So those are actually on two different subnets. It would be host ID 200 on subnet 35 and host ID 26 on subnet 61. So we really cannot tell at a glance with many IP addresses which subnet they're located on until we examine the subnet mask, and that's an integral part in the IP addressing scheme. Now let's see how TCP/IP actually uses binary arithmetic to filter out the network ID using the subnet mask. In this example, we have an IP address. Let me just write in the actual decimal notations for this IP address. This is 159.224.7.129. And let's just look at a simple one of these, and then we'll actually show you an easier way to compute binary to decimal equivalents. Let's take the number 7, for example. Remember, in our binary counting scheme, the first one indicates ones, the second one indicates twos, and the third one indicates fours. So we have 4 plus 2 plus 1, for a total of 7. This last one is fairly easy as well. The highest order digit is 128. The lowest digit is 1. We add those two together. It's 129. But let's see an easier way to help you calculate binary to decimal, or back again. And also, this can help you if you take the Microsoft certification tests. Let's go ahead and open up our calculator. This is one of the accessories that comes with Windows. And if we open up our calculator, typically it starts like this. Just a standard little 4-function calculator, but it can do much more. If we go to our View menu and choose the Scientific View, notice one of the options we have here is to convert from different numbering schemes. So we have hexadecimal, decimal, octal, and binary. So if I have an address, like let's say my 137, I'll go ahead and enter that. Notice I still have the decimal button depressed. If I want to see what 137 is in binary, I just click the binary button, and it looks like it's 1, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 0, 1. So now I know the binary equivalent. If you take the Microsoft certification test for TCP/IP, the calculator is included in the software that's available for you when you take that test. So you don't have to become really proficient at converting binary to decimal or decimal to binary. It's available there for you. Now certainly you could take the test more quickly if you were able to do those in your head. And I know that when I took the test, I actually did them in my head and then checked my numbers with the calculator. It's so easy to make a mistake in that kind of pressure-packed environment. So just a little tip for you to help make your life easier, whether you're trying to calculate these addresses in real life or if you're in a testing situation. So anyway, let's go back now to our example. We had our addresses of 159. Let's write these in again real quickly. 224, 7, and 129. And we have a subnet mask of all ones, 0, and 0. Now go ahead and figure out what these are at home. You can play along there. Okay, time's up. First one is a 255, as you probably guessed by all the ones. Second one, it's a tough one, 255, right? Then 0 and 0. So a standard subnet mask for a Class B network, for example. Now as we apply this to our IP address, we use an AND process. And when we're using an AND, that means if both numbers are a 1, it flows through as a 1. If either of the numbers are a 0, it's a 0. If both numbers are a 0, it's a 0. So the only time a 1 ever flows through is if both the subnet mask digit and the IP address digit are a 1. So now let's look at the result of this AND process. Our 1 flows down, our zeros don't, our 1s flow down, and these 1s flow down, these zeros don't. But notice the effective result here. 1001, 11111 flows down just the same. And this octet here, 3 1s followed by 5 zeros, flows down just the same. It's as I mentioned earlier, the subnet mask is a lot like a pipe. If we have the 1s, a 1 will always flow through and a 0 always flows through. If we don't have the 1s, in other words, if the remaining part of the subnet mask is 0, let's see what happens there. Well, 0, 0, 0, all across, those all just translate into zeros, but 1 and 0, the result of that is 0. So the 1s will not flow through if the subnet mask is 0. That's where I mentioned that these zeros act like a sponge. They stop that from flowing through, and so it appears as zeros down below. And remember, the result here of our AND process of the IP address with the subnet mask is to determine what the network ID will be. So this subnet mask is saying use the first 2 octets for the network ID, use the last 2 octets for the host ID. So our resulting network ID is 159.224. And the last 2 octets we can represent by X and Y will be used for our host ID. And that's exactly how TCP/IP does it with this binary AND process. Now that we understand how a subnet mask is used to divide an IP address into a network ID with subnets and a resulting host ID, let's see how to actually decide which subnet mask we will use. Now, this subnet mask will allow us to have enough subnets and yet also give us enough host IDs within each subnet. As we're deciding the number of subnet mask bits to use, which is actually the value of the subnet mask we'll use, we have to decide how many subnets we need and how many hosts that we need. In the example on the screen, in a Class B network, we typically use a subnet mask of 255 with the remaining octet 0. That would not allow us to use any subnets. If we're going to design a subnet mask that allows us to use subnets, then we begin to use a number in the 3rd octet. And it's the magnitude of this number, the value of this number, that will determine how many subnets we can have and how many hosts we can have. So we see that if we pick a subnet mask only using a couple of digits, we have a very small number of subnets. We could have only 2 subnets, for example. Or we could use the entire 3rd octet, make that a 255, and then we'd have 254 subnets available for us. Of course, as we begin to expand the number of subnets, that reduces the number of hosts that we have. For example, if I only use 2 subnets, that leaves me with about 16,000 hosts on each subnet. Remember, if I don't use any subnets, I have about 65,000 hosts on a Class B network. However, if I use all of the possible subnets in that 3rd octet, in other words, if I plan for 254 subnets, that only leaves the 4th octet here to be used for host IDs. And remember, I can only use the digits 1 through 254 for those host IDs, so that's the most I could have. So I may be limiting myself quite severely if I design a subnet mask that has room for too many subnets. So these are critical factors to use as I'm deciding what the value of my subnet mask will be. Well, let's look at an example with a Class B network of dividing that network ID into local subnets. And to do that, of course, we'll calculate a subnet mask. In this example, we would like to determine a subnet mask for a Class B network that will allow us enough subnets and yet reserve enough host IDs. And here's kind of a procedure we go through. First of all, we decide how many subnets am I going to need. Once I've decided that, take that number and convert it into binary. And then we'll make a subnet mask by taking those binary digits so we can actually filter out our IP address and give us enough subnets as the end result. So now let's walk through this process. We've decided we want 6 subnets. So we take the number 6 and we convert it into binary. Now remember, we're using 8 digits, but in this example 6 will only use the lower 3 digits. 6 is 4 plus 2, so we put 1 in the 4 spot, 1 in the 2 spot, a 0 in the 1 spot. That adds up to 6. So binary 6 is 110. Now remember that when we're using a subnet mask, we typically want the higher numbers to be 1s and the lower numbers to be 0s, because all the lower digits are used for our host ID, all the upper digits up here are used for our network ID. So what we want to do is to shift these binary digits up. Now what we've really computed here by calculating this binary value is how many digits we need to represent 6 subnets. And we've seen that we need 3 binary digits. So we simply take the top 3 binary digits for our subnet mask. And so that translates into decimal of 224. That's 128 plus 64 plus 32. And that would allow us at least 6 subnets with plenty of addresses left for our host IDs. Let's look at one more example using the same process. Let's look at the same example we just used, but let's change the numbers around a little bit. Let's say that 6 subnets will not be enough for us. Let's say we need 10. Well, how is 10 expressed in binary? Remember that 6 is 110. The next binary digit after 4 is the 8s. Well, 10 includes an 8, so we'll put a 1 there. 4 plus 8 would be too much, so that would be a 0. Add a 2 to it, that makes a 10, and then we go to 0 again. Of course, the upper digits would all be 0. And so what we've determined by this calculation is we need 4 binary digits to get us 10 subnets. So our subnet mask now would have the upper 4 digits as a 1 and the lower 4 digits as zeros. And that value would be, let's see, we had 128, 64, 32. We'd add another 16 to this. The result would be 240. So a subnet mask that would allow us at least 10 subnets would be 255, 255, 240.0. In fact, let me just show you a little trick here for easily deciding what the binary value of something is. Let me just do this little trick to clear my screen again. Let's say I wanted 20 subnets. So we'll cross out 6 and we'll put 20. If you're familiar with the different levels of binary, remember this is 1s, 2s, 4s, 8s, 16s, 32s, 64s, and 128s, then you can readily calculate what the binary value of something is. Let me just clear my screen once more. So we're going to use the number 20 we said. Okay, we find the largest binary digit that is not larger than 20. So 1, that's not larger than 20, but 2 is still less than 20, 4 is still less than 20, 8 is still less than 20, 16 is still less than 20, 64 has crossed over. So we certainly know we can't have any 64s or higher, so those will all be zeros. So that's set. So we'll now pick 1 of 16. Okay, if we subtract 16 from 20, that leaves us a 4. So we'll go down to the 4 digit, and we'll put a 1 there, and all the rest would be 0. So you go up to the largest binary digit that's included in your number, put a 1 there, subtract it from your number, and then walk down the binary digits, filling out the remaining values. Now that was a pretty round example. Let's just do one more. Let's do 25. So we'll replace this with 25. Okay, 1s, 2s, 4s, 8s, 16s. That's still less than 25. 32 is larger than 25, so we'll back up to the 16s and we'll go there. Okay, that leaves us with 9. Well, if we go to the next digit, 8, 8 would certainly be included in 9, so we'll add a binary digit for that one as well. That leaves us with 1, so we'd do a 0 there, and a 1 in our ones position. So binary 11001 is decimal 25. But if you do these things in your head, that's a reasonably easy method to calculate these things. But as I mentioned, you may want to use the calculator as a backstop, because I certainly make mistakes as well. Now that we've calculated a subnet mask, let's see how we can actually designate values for our different subnets. In our last example, we decided that a subnet of 255, 255, 224.0 would allow us to have at least 6 subnets for a Class B network. Well, let's see how we would assign addresses to those 6 subnets. Remember that we talked that when you assign a network ID, you don't want to use all zeros and you don't want to use all ones. So we'll just do the international no symbol here and not use those. That leaves us these combinations of those 3 digits. Remember that only the 3 upper digits are going to be used to specify our subnet. The lower 5 digits in the third octet represent the host ID. So we have 001, 010, 011, 100, 100, 101, and 110. That's counting in binary, of course. Now, at first glance, if we just look at the red digits, that looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. That's certainly the number of subnets that we'd planned for. However, we need to keep in mind that we're talking about 8 binary digits here. So we have to compute the actual decimal value that includes all 8 of those digits. The subnet mask will filter off the upper 3 digits and treat those as our network ID, but it will let the lower 5 digits be used as our host ID. So if we look at the first one, 001 with 5 zeros, the first digit is our 1s, the second digit is our 2s, our 4s, our 8s, our 16s, our 32s, pardon me, 64s. I know you can't read these numbers, but I'm having a lot of fun drawing them. And then the last digit is 128. So the last 3 digits we're concerned with are 128, 64, and 32. So now 001 is 32. 010, that's 164, that's 64. 011 is 64 plus 32 is 96. 100, that's 128, so 128. 101 is 128 plus 32, that's 160. And 110 is 128 plus 64 for a sum of 192. These are the 6 different numbers that will give us our different subnets. So for example, if I was using an IP addressing scheme of 131.107 dot something dot whatever, if I use 32, 64, and 96, let's say I put a .1 after all of these. Let me just correct that 94 to a 96. Now I have 3 different subnets. Remember that our subnet mask is designating this as a different subnet than this one, and I can have the same host ID because this is host 1 on subnet 32, this is host 1 on subnet 64, and this is host 1 on subnet 96. So now I'm using my subnet mask to break things up for me. Now I can get a little more complicated with the way I number my clients, but we'll see this in a few minutes. Well, since we've been having so much fun with binary arithmetic, I thought I'd show you a quicker way to calculate the subnets using your subnet mask. As you may have noticed in our last example, we kept counting by 32. So we started with 32, plus another 32 is 64, plus another 32 is 96, 128, 160, and 192. Using this principle, we can actually calculate our different subnet addresses much more easily. Here we have a shortcut to help us calculate our subnet IDs a little more easily. First of all, we look at our subnet mask and we look at the highest digits that we're using. So here's a subnet mask using the top two, and then we take, that's a 192 subnet mask, by the way, 128 plus 64. The lowest value of those digits is the 64-bit. So that's the decimal number that we're going to use. Then we take those two digits by themselves. So we just take the 1-1 and we convert that into decimal. 1-1 binary is 3 decimal. And remember, we cannot use all of our subnets. So we'd subtract 1 because we can't use all of those, and that only leaves us 2 subnets left. And so we just begin with this decimal number we calculated, 64, and we add to it. So we can use 64 for a subnet. We can use 128 for a subnet. Well, why can't we use 0? Remember we said we can't use all zeros. Why can't we use 192? That's all ones. So this would be 0, 1, and that's 1, 0 for those two digits. We can't use 0, 0. That's not allowed. We can't use 1, 1. That's not allowed. So that's why we had to subtract 1 up here when we were determining the number of subnets that were possible. Now that was a really simple example. Let's back up one, look at that example with the 32s we just talked about, and use this shortcut scheme. Okay, we had 3 values in this case, 3 digits that we're using, and this one is 128, this one is 64, and that's 32. So our lowest value is 32. So that's what we're going to count by. And then we take these 3 digits and we convert them to binary, but just treat them as if they were a number by themselves. So 1, 1, 1 in binary is equal to, let's see, that would be 4 plus 2 plus 1. That's 7 decimal. And we subtract 1 from that to determine how many subnets we have available. 6. So we begin at 32, and then we keep adding 32 until we've determined 6 subnets. And that's all we've done here. We start with 32. We add 32 to get 64. Add it again, we get 96. Again, 128. Again, 160. Again, 192. That gives us our 6 subnets. And we saw, of course, the corresponding binary values associated with those. Of course, we can't use all zeros. That's not allowed. And we can't use all ones. That's not allowed. But if you get into much more complicated subnetting, let's, for example, use 7 digits. Let me just clear my screen here briefly. We used 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, and a 0. That would be 254, by the way. Because remember that all ones is 255. Here we're just taking 1 away, so that's 254. Let's use that same scheme. What's our lowest order digit? That's a 2. So decimal 2. How many values can we have? Well, we have to subtract 1 from that. Or I'm sorry. What we do is we take the all the ones digits and convert that into a binary number. So 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. What does that equal to in decimal? We know that if it were 8 ones, it would be 255. Here we're only using 7 ones, so we take 255 and subtract 128. And if my math is anywhere correct, I think that should be 127. Subtract 1. That leaves us with 126 possible subnets. And we begin counting with the number 2. So we'd go 2, 4, 6, 8. Those would be all the different subnet possibilities that we have. So as you get more complicated subnet masks, this shortcut can actually help you compute your different subnets more easily. We spent a lot of time talking about how subnet masks are used to compute the different values for our subnets. Now let's see how to compute the host ID numbers using the same subnet mask. In this example, we're using the same subnet mask that we've been using in the past. And in particular, the octet that we're talking about had the value of 224. That was represented by the top 3 digits being used as the subnet mask. The remaining 5 digits are going to be used for our host ID. And we saw the different host ID numbers, the different subnet ID numbers, 32 through 192, counting in increments of 32. So for example, here are some ranges of addresses we can use. If I have an address of .32.1, that would be a unique host. .32.2 is a unique host, and so on. However, I can have a host on the same subnet that would have a different number. If I did 33.2, that's on the same subnet as 32.2. And let's see how that works in our subnetting. Let me just clear my screen for a moment here. Okay, if I have 32.2, my 32 is going to be indicated by this value here. There's 32 right there. And then my other octet is going to be a 2. Okay, that's great. What if I have 33.2? Well, 33 is going to be the 32 right here with a 1 down there. So let me just write that up here. 0, 0, 1, 0, 0, 0, 0, 1. There's my 5 digits. Remember, the upper 3 are used for my subnet. The lower 5 are used for my host. So even the decimal number appears to be different, 32 and 33, as far as the binary values are concerned. And when I look at the digits that are being used for my subnet, 32 and 33 are considered on the same subnet. And I can go clear up to 63 as part of this subnet. 63, let me just clear the screen once more here, would be 32 in the upper 3, with all the rest of these being 1. And as I convert that with my subnet mask, again, it would look at the upper 3 digits and say, well, that's just a 32. That's on the same subnet. But it would look at the lower 5 digits and say, oh, that's a different host ID than what you had before. This is why it's possible for us to have a lot more host IDs if I don't use all of the digits for my subnet mask. So I can use all 5 of these digits for a host ID in addition to the remaining 8 digits, so up to 254 in the next octet. So I have a lot more possibilities when I'm doing this. But this is how I assign my host ID addresses. Now, one other thing I want to point out to you, notice that any addresses lower than .32 will not be valid. So if I had an address of like 16.1, that would not be valid. Why? Let's look at that for a moment. Let me just clear the screen here. 16 binary is going to be, let's see, that's on my 1s, 2s, 4s, 8s, 16s. And we'll change that to a 0. That would be 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 0, 0, 0. If I apply my subnet mask to this, what digits do I have in the subnet field? Those 3, they're zeros. Remember that we don't allow zeros for subnets. And in fact, in our scheme, I said I had to have 32, so at least one of my digits up here was a 1. So that's why you have to have them at least 32, and then of course the last can go with everything all filled up. Boy, that was a lot of work. We learned a lot of things about subnet masking there. We reviewed the binary arithmetic we talked about, how a subnet mask is converted to binary, and TCP/IP takes that subnet mask and does a binary AND with your IP address to determine which component of the address is the network ID and which component is the host ID. Now this is extremely important when you're doing IP addressing. It can help you resolve a lot of problems out there on your network. If you're not careful in assigning the subnet mask, or you're not careful in assigning the network ID or the host ID, you just won't be able to communicate. So you need to calculate these things very carefully. Also, those of you who are interested in certification, this understanding of binary and subnetting and which network IDs you have, which host IDs you have, how many different subnets you can have is extremely important in the testing environment. Most of the rest of the test just concerns what you can do with the software, which is quite easy if you've used the software much at all. But this conceptual subnet masking that we've been talking about using the binary arithmetic is really crucial for you to understanding how IP works and if you ever certify to pass that certification exam. Now that we understand all the intricacies of TCP/IP addressing, let's go back to our original TCP/IP installation and test it to see if it was correct. And we can test it more completely now that we understand what those addresses actually mean. As you may recall, when we installed TCP/IP on this NT server, we gave it a specific IP address and subnet mask. Let's review what address we gave to this server. First of all, let's go to Network Neighborhood and look at the properties of the network. We'll go to the Protocols tab and we'll examine the TCP/IP protocol. Now we could either double-click here and it will bring up the properties, or I can highlight it and click the Properties button. And here's the address that we hard-coded in. It's 131.107.4.10. And as we look at our subnet mask, 255.255.255.0, as you'll recall from what we learned, that indicates that the first 3 octets are being used for our network ID. This is a Class B network, so 131.107 is the normal Class B address. 4 is a subnet on that network. And then 10 is the host ID. We've also specified a way for us to communicate with the outside world. In other words, if we want to talk to someone who's beyond our own little subnet, and to do that we've given it a default gateway. So here it is, 131.107.4.1. Now let's see what happens as we try to test this connection. I'll close out the properties here. And most Microsoft IP utilities are command line. They don't give us GUI utilities for a lot of this stuff. Always kind of surprised me because Microsoft is supposedly the king of GUI, but they definitely didn't do it for TCP/IP. Let's open up our command prompt. And the utility that's most often used to test a connection is the ping utility. So let's go ahead and type that in, and then we type an IP address. Now in this case, I'm going to try to ping another machine. I think I have one out there that's 131.107.2.10. That's on another subnet, subnet 2, and we'll see what happens. Now notice the reply we're getting here. It tells us we're getting a reply from the address and tells us how many bytes and the time it took for the reply and the time to live for the packet that was sent back. This type of response with the 4 successful replies is typical of a successful connection. So I'm able to see the outside world and talk with this client. Let me go ahead and type in an address that's incorrect. Let me try like 101. And this will take a little longer, but notice it's saying request timed out. That's indicative of not being able to connect to that machine. Now that could be attributable to a number of problems. It could be attributable to a bad address I'm trying to ping, or it could be that the things I have configured for IP are not correct. Now let's look at some problems with IP where you have an unsuccessful connection because of the way we've configured things. Let's go back to our TCP/IP configuration by looking at the properties of our network, going to Protocols, and editing the properties for TCP/IP. And let's remove our default gateway. So we'll just delete that address, highlighting each component and deleting it. And we'll say OK. And now the change is there. Now let's go and try to ping a remote host. This is a host that is on another subnet, subnet 2. We were able to successfully ping it a moment ago. And now it's saying it's unreachable. Notice, by the way, how quickly that response came back. The reason it's unreachable is because TCP/IP looks at that address, it looks at the subnet mask and says, well, you're not on the same subnet, and I have to send it out remotely, but we took away the address for the default gateway, which is the address of a router. I don't have one, so there's no way for me to communicate with that remote host. So I've cut that off. Notice, however, I can still ping myself, for example. Or I can still ping, oops, let me just call up the old one, save some typing here. I can still ping the router card because that's still considered on my same subnet. But if I try to ping another card on the router that's like 3.1, I won't be able to because that's again considered on a different subnet. So that's one problem you can see if your default gateway is configured incorrectly or it's just not there at all. Now let's look at what happens when our subnet mask is not configured correctly. Let's go back and fix our default gateway in our TCP/IP configuration. We'll go ahead and enter that gateway information again. By the way, some tips as you're entering these addresses. As you type a 3-digit number, it will automatically skip to the next octet. So notice as I finished typing 131, it automatically jumped over to the next octet. So I type 107, it automatically jumps over. But now if I'm typing a number like 4, it doesn't jump over. Now I could use the arrows or something, but if you like to keep your fingers on the keyboard, if you can touch type like I can, you can just hit the space and it will automatically jump you to the next field. So that can kind of help. And there's our gateway address there. And that should have fixed our problem. What I'd like to do now, however, is to change our subnet mask. Now remember that we have been using subnets on our network. It's a Class B network, but we subnetted it. What I'm going to do is change the subnet mask back to the default subnet for a Class B network. So we'll change the third octet to 0. This means that only the first 2 octets are used to identify the network, and the last 4 are used to identify the host ID. I'll go ahead and close this out. And now, let me try to ping my neighbor on another network, another subnet. So 131.107.2.10. And now we failed. Now he's still out there. The trouble is the way the subnet mask interpreted my IP address. What it said was only the first 2 octets, the 131, in fact, let's go back there for a moment. The 131.107, only those 2 numbers specify my network. The 4.10 must be the host number, and since the address I was pinging also started with 131.107, it thinks that that host is on the same local network, so it will not send out the routing information. So there's no way that I can now communicate with that remote client unless I fix the subnet mask. So let's go ahead and fix that. Change it back to the correct value. Close it out. Now let's try pinging once more. And now notice our ping is successful because now it can see that yes, I do need to route this. It's not on the same subnet, so I'll go ahead and go over to the router. Now the router can locate the host with this address and we can ping successfully. So those are some problems you can encounter when the subnet mask is not configured correctly. Another problem you can have as well is if the subnet mask has too many bits that are set to 1. So for example, if I change my subnet mask from, pardon me there, if I change the subnet mask from 0 at the end to say 254, oops, 2 works better than a 1, this would mean that, let's try that one more time, let's try 252. Okay. This would mean that the last 2 digits are used for the host ID, the last 2 binary digits, and everything else is used for a network ID. Now, as I try to ping, I can't even ping my router anymore because I can ping myself, but I can't ping anyone else because it's not interpreting those last numbers correctly. It's treating them as network ID numbers instead of host ID numbers. So you can get some very strange results if your subnet mask is not configured correctly. There's a technique we can use with the ping utility to allow us to diagnose exactly where our IP address may be configured incorrectly. This screen shows a way we can test our IP configuration, kind of working from our own computer out to a remote host to see if we're configured properly. Let's look at each of these steps quickly. Step 1, we execute a utility called ipconfig. Again, this is done through the command line. This just tells us what our IP address is, what our default gateway is, what our subnet mask is. If you as an administrator walk up to a remote machine, you have no idea what its configuration is, this is a very quick way for you to determine this. The second step would just be to ping a loopback address. As you may recall, we could not use 127 as a network ID. That's because that's reserved for loopback, which is a diagnostic thing. If we ping this IP address, it simply checks to see if the IP stack is loaded and bound to your adapter card. If it is, it'll respond back correctly. Then, step 3, we can ping our own IP address, the address of the machine we're troubleshooting. If that works correctly, then IP is installed, it's bound to the adapter card, and it can find our own address on the network. Because when we ping, it actually sends a signal out on the network which bounces right back to our own machine. Number 4, then we ping our gateway. That's the address on our router somewhere. If we can ping that successfully, that's usually indicative of being able to communicate with the outside world. And finally, we could ping a remote host. If we ping that, then we should be able to talk to anyone we need. We'll go to our TCP/IP configuration and fix any problems we may have created here. Okay, we need to fix our subnet mask back to 0. We'll save that. Let me just walk you through these steps now. We'll go to a command prompt. By the way, I've made a shortcut here for my command prompt because I'm going to it so much. But in the NT40 interface or in the Windows 95 interface, the command prompt is located by going to Start, Programs, and then the command prompt. But I'll just do it here from my desktop. It's a little quicker. Okay, I type ipconfig. And let's look at the pieces of information it gives me. It gives me the IP address of this machine, 131.107.4.10. Gives me the subnet mask, 255.255.255.0. And it gives me my default gateway. So I could check these against known values. If something was wrong there, I could quickly spot it. The next thing I want to do is to ping the loopback. That's 127.0.0.1. And again, as I mentioned, that just checks to see if IP is installed. Then I'm going to ping my own address, 131.107.4.10. That's showing that my address is valid. It's recognized on the network. I'm going to ping my default gateway. This lets me know that I do have a path to the outside world. And finally, I'll ping a remote host. And I've gone through all those steps. I've proven that I have valid IP connectivity. Now, what a lot of administrators will do is skip immediately to the last step. If they've just installed TCP/IP, they want to know if it's working properly, they'll just go ahead and say, let me just ping 131.107.3.1. Okay, that works. Everything must be working properly. Because all those steps we saw were inclusive of each other. They're getting more complicated. Each is building on the other. So if we can ping a remote host, everything is working okay. Then if that doesn't work, they'll back up, say, okay, well that didn't work. Let me see if it's my gateway. So in fact, let me just try to ping 3.10. Okay, that timed out, so something's wrong. I'm not talking to the outside world. So let me back up a step now and ping my default gateway. That's 4.1. and that's working. So in this case, it looks like the problem with my communication is with the remote address because my gateway is working just fine. So by working through this process, you can identify where the configuration is wrong. Is it the remote address that's wrong? Is it the gateway that's configured wrong? Is it the IP that's not installed properly? Is the subnet mask interpreting the addresses incorrectly? By using this ping methodology, you can discover the trouble in many cases. In this section, we learned how to resolve TCP/IP conflicts by using the IP config and the ping utilities. We also learned how an incorrectly configured subnet mask can cause communication problems on the network. In this video, we got our first introduction to TCP/IP. We learned about the suite of protocols, some of the different utilities that come with that suite. We learned a lot about binary arithmetic, the TCP/IP addressing scheme, subnet masks, and how all of those things fit together to help TCP/IP see what your network is, what your host ID is, and how it can route messages from one computer to another. In the next video, we'll get into the nitty-gritty of the Microsoft TCP/IP utilities. We'll see how to install and configure those so you can fine-tune the TCP/IP communications on your network.
We hope you've enjoyed this training session and, more importantly, increased your knowledge and productivity. Keystone Learning Systems offers hundreds of courses including MS Office, Novell Perfect Office, NetWare, Lotus Smart Suite, Lotus Notes, Power Builder, Corel Draw, PageMaker, and many, many more. Each is designed to accelerate your learning curve and increase your productivity. Each makes a nice addition to your computer training library. Call us today if you have any additional questions or would like to place an order. Our phone number in the United States and Canada is 1-800-748-4838. And if you're calling from somewhere else in the world, please dial 801-375-8680. Thank you.
nice shot of the front porch.
Leave the camera right where it is. We're gonna do this shot with me on the roof.
Tim, not a good idea.
Mo, let's get something straight here. This is Tool Time. It's a man show, dangerous, kind of devil-may-care. We'll do the shot with me up on the roof.
Okay. The roof is unsafe.
Now you're an expert on roofs, Maureen?
Well, no, not really, but I've been inside, and I do know that those 1x4s are too far apart.
Huh?
Take a look at that sheathing. There's rot everywhere.
Maureen, I think I can tell the difference between a safe and an unsafe roof. Al, you follow me up here?
I don't think so, Tim.
Oh, fine.
The sun is really drying my skin out.
You know, I have some moisturizer.
Shut up, Al!
All right, everybody, let's roll.
Hi, welcome to Tool Time. As you can see, our 1955 ranch home needs a lot of work, especially the roof. Now, you want to have a professional examine any weak or discolored areas like these and make sure they're properly attended to. For now, we'll just hop over these to a safer area. It's a little weak here. You want to avoid this area. Hey, Wilson, what are you doing?
I'm gathering herbs. A warm bath of eucalyptus and rosemary can be quite invigorating.
Oh, it sounds very aromatic, yeah. I had a really bad day. Maybe I should try some of that.
Darn good idea. Well, I'll see you.
Oh, hold it, Wilson. I gotta ask you something.
Well, maybe we could do this tomorrow, Tim?
No. I need to ask you right now. It seems like everything in my life is up in the air. Mm-hmm. Everything's changing. Well, there's this woman that came into Tool Time and she's trying to take it over. And, well, I've made Tool Time a success, you know, over 3 years. And I don't think it needs any change.
Well, Tim, sometimes change can be a good thing. Good night.
Wait, Wilson?
Yeah, sure. Be right there. Bye.
Hey, Brad, can I talk to you for a minute?
Sorry, Dad. I told Jennifer I'd be right there.
Oh. Hey, buddy, Mark. I need to talk to somebody.
You can always talk to me.
Good. I'm gonna sit down here for a minute. Oh. Come here. I'm gonna try to work this out, okay? Let's say you got this business, a bubblegum factory. Somebody comes in and tries
Do I have cherry bubble gum?
Oh, yeah. Probably racks up the best they have, of course. A lot of that cherry bubblegum. Anyway, so...
Do I have baseball cards?
Yeah, but you got baseball cards, and you've got a little assistant with a little beard. Whatever you want, you got everything. Anyway, so you got this bubblegum factory, cherry bubblegum and the baseball stuff, and this girl comes in, tries to run things. You know, you've been running it for quite a while, made a big success out of it, but this little red-headed little nice little girl, she comes in and takes over. What do you do?
I tell Mommy.
But Mommy's not home, is she? And so the girl takes over your bubblegum factory. You know, it's just the way life is, Mark.
Can I go play now?
Yeah, go play. I'll fix dinner.
Hi, honey. Oh, Tim. I am so good. I had the best first day. I mean, I didn't get lost. I didn't screw anything up. Not one person yelled at me. And get this, look at this, check it out. My own electronic security card.
You know, this is great. I'm so proud of you, hon.
What's the matter with you? You're limping.
I fell through a roof.
What?
Yeah, right through the subfloor. Luckily, the basement broke my fall.
Honey, are you all right?
Yeah, my leg's okay. It's my life that's wrecked.
What do you mean?
Everything seems to be changing for me. You went to work, Wilson's taking a bath, Al looks like Don Ho.
No, wait a minute. Wait, just, what are you talking about?
I told you this yesterday. Binford went and got married to a model and left the whole Tool Time thing in charge of his daughter, Maureen. So she's got... She's got everybody working against me. Al, the crew. This woman's trying to take over Tool Time.
Well, she can't do that. I mean, you spent the last 3 years making Tool Time a success.
That's right.
You're the only reason anybody watches that show.
That's right.
Well, who the hell does she think she is?
Maureen Binford.
Wait a minute. Is she the one that always comes to the Halloween party dressed like a hacksaw?
Yeah.
Little red-headed thing about this big?
Yeah.
I can take her.